It's time for a history lesson. Despite its march toward imperialism, Japan introduced a jury system in the early 20th century, with the intent of showing the budding League of Nations that Japan had made democratic strides as a country. However, political pressure meant that this jury would not break at the empire's fabric more than necessary. The jury was limited to tax-paying males of 30 years or older, and only required for felony charges, excluding most major offenses against the government itself, such as treason. Defendants gave up their right to appeal when undergoing a jury trial, and, if they wished for a jury to hear a misdemeanor case, they had to pay for the jurors' travel expenses themselves. Jury verdicts were neither unanimous nor binding, nor even directly affecting the defendant's guilt in many cases, often instead related to the basic facts of the case. Jury trials were faster, averaging 2 days instead of 14 months for so-called bench trials without a jury, and acquittal rates were 5 times higher during its existence than in the years preceding the adoption of the current lay judge system. However, nearly all sides took issue with the imperial jury. Defendants often bore heavy cost, whether financial or through giving up some of their rights in exchange for a trial by jury. Counsel would at times recommend the bench over the jury because, while the chance for conviction was lower, the opportunity to appeal would drop to zero. Judges also argued to defendants to waive their right to a jury trial for this reason, in addition to conservative opinions that a judge's word was not to be intruded upon by commoners. Prosecutors disliked the higher acquittal rate that the system brought about, and complained that court preparation became more difficult and expensive for the state as well. Finally, the Second World War acted as a double whammy to seal the deal. Most people eligible for jury duty were actively performing military duty, and with the Axis powers ostracized from the rest of the developed world, Japan no longer had a reason to pretend that they held such democratic values. The system was formally suspended in 1943 and stayed that way despite Western intervention after the war because, according to the Ministry of Justice, the citizens of Japan had seen their empire, and thus its jury system, fail, and cultural differences meant that Japanese society had no need for such a system. Japan's 20th century jury came and went in just 25 years. According to a 2001 paper by Takashi Maruta, anti-jury sentiments came in 3 flavors. Some have said that the Japanese people, in their deference to and respect for authority, would rather have officially certified judges hand down criminal verdicts. Others have argued that the general citizenry, being used to such deference, regardless of whether they might agree with such authority, would not be fit to adjudicate trials due to a lack of experience or the proper mindset. Finally, the issue of cost has been brought up, that jury trials are more expensive than those without. Maruta disagrees with these points' relevance. While jurors can be biased, so too are judges human, and they are far from immune from bias themselves. One of the key arguments in favor of a jury, after all, is the idea that several people's biases will cancel each other out, so that they may arrive at an ultimately fair verdict after their deliberation. Due to their lack of trial experience, judges may indeed be better than jurors at fact-finding and analysis, but, again, this does not make formalized judges infallible, and being slightly more fallible does not mean that jurors' capabilities are entirely compromised. In fact, while Japan declined to reinstitute a jury system after the Second World War, the Allied powers were able to convince Japan to adopt the Prosecutorial Review Commission, effectively a grand jury. Beginning in 1948, the PRC would investigate judicial decisions and make recommendations to legal officials. Japan's conviction rate has been so historically high that, rather than a venue favoring the defense, the PRC would often look into the possibility that a rare not guilty verdict might be the result of corruption. The PRC's recommendations were not legally binding until it was revised, along with the creation of the lay judge system in 2009, but it was still an influential body, according to Maruta and an analysis by Hiroshi Fukurai. As for the cost argument, Maruta retorted that judicial spending at the time overall was less than 1% of the country's budget, claiming that such expenditures are not so costly on the whole. I will note that the only citation for this source is the name of a supposed attorney, Inamoto. Searching anything similar to Inamoto 1968 has yielded no relevant results. I have also been unable to find any statistics, past or present, on how much Japan has spent on either its trials or the judicial branch in general. If anyone is able to provide sources and information on these fronts, I would greatly appreciate it. Arguments both for and against the jury system are multifold. While a jury of laypersons is capable of interpreting laws in ways that fit their community standards and handing down verdicts that the average citizen feels is fair, traditional setups force consistency and continuity between rulings. A jury means that every voice is heard, but if some of those voices would corrupt the law for their own benefit, a rigid legalistic approach becomes ideal. Following the Second World War, Japan's legal system had become so legalistic and bureaucratic that there was only one officialized law school in the nation. Several nationwide systems have been put in place to ensure uniformity among judicial systems. As of the late 2000s, just before the lay judge system was to be implemented, Japan only had one jurisdiction, with the same criminal laws applying to the whole of the country. To ensure that judges at all levels of the system are keen to follow judicial standard, even prestigious members of the Secretariat, the governing body of the Supreme Court, would be assigned to lower courts. If a lower court's judge questions their own decision, they would often seek advice from the Secretariat, whose opinions were almost always followed. The Supreme Court had spent more than half a century opposing any interference to what it saw as its sacred duty, whether from the concept of a layperson's jury or from any dissenting judges within the judiciary itself. The 70s and 80s saw several decades-late acquittals of death row inmates, emblazoning calls for reform. The Supreme Court lightly entertained the idea, with studies of foreign jury systems and mock trials for citizens, but the greatest push for a jury, says Ingram Weber, legal scholar of the University of Pennsylvania, came thanks to economic turmoil. The Supreme Court was just one example of Japan's overly bureaucratic government, which the people blamed for the collapse of their economy heading into the 90s. Japan wanted more transparency and accessibility into the workings of their government, including their courts. By the end of the century, the Judicial System Reform Council was set in place, encouraging discussion on all judiciary matters, including the potential implementation of a jury system. The JSRC, made up of those in the legal profession, reasoned that lay people's participation was necessary to restore faith in the court system, and that such participation would require more efficient trials on the whole. Jury trials would give voice to the diversifying values and beliefs of the Japanese people as well. Some in the council even argued that career judges, being secluded from society at large due to their often elite backgrounds and time spent behind the bench, were unable to properly hand down decisions aligning with the values of their citizens. However, the Supreme Court did not wish to give all judicial control to a jury, and a compromise was reached: a mixed jury system meant for use only in the most serious of cases, such as those involving the death penalty. Typically, such cases involve 6 laypeople and 3 professional judges, though other combinations, such as 4 laypeople and 1 judge, are meant for simpler trials. At least 1 professional and 1 lay judge must each subscribe to the overall majority opinion for it to become valid. In this way, there is a sort of balance between the bureaucracy and the public of Japan's courts, and there must be at least some agreement between long-standing officials and society at large. Legislation to introduce the lay judge system passed in 2004, with nearly 100% of the vote in the Diet, Japan's version of Congress. However, it was not implemented until 2009. Apollo Justice, Ace Attorney, arrived on Japanese shelves in 2007 and happened to sell quite well. It was the 29th best-selling game of 2007, reaching more than 500,000 DS consoles in its release year. However, it is unclear how much sales affected people's perception of the lay judge system. After all, it's only brought up in full in the 4th case, and even then it's only mentioned a few times. I can, however, reveal Japanese society's initial and current feelings about their jury system, and try to explain why it isn't used in future mainline Ace Attorney games. According to David T. Johnson, a sociology professor from the University of Hawaii, 4 in 5 Japanese adults showed disinterest in being a lay judge as of early 2009, and legal and government bodies alike resisted the change. However, the demand to see these trials play out was so great that he was unable to get a seat, and, fortunately for our purposes and his, the first few lay judge trials received massive media coverage. Many of the conservative fears seemed to be unfounded. Turnout of those summoned for the first 2 trials was over 90%, the lay judges were inquisitive during the trials and talkative after, and, contrary to the trends of the 20th century jury, the cases ended with harsher sentencing than was considered normal for the defendant's circumstances. In 2019, the Supreme Court even cited surveys claiming that the vast majority of lay judges saw merit in their trial participation. However, this does not mean that everyone in Japan enjoys the idea. As per the same report, the Supreme Court admitted that the operation of the system is still in a developing stage, end quote. In other words, results aren't exactly what they'd like to say. Interest in being a lay judge petered rather quickly after its first few trials, as half of those summoned in 2009 declined duty for work-related or other personal reasons, and by 2019, that percentage had increased to 2/3. Estimates hover between 30 and 40% of people not showing up for screening at all, and this gives the enthusiasm rate of lay judges a new meaning. That those who are already interested in legal matters, and who have enough time on their hands, self-select to take part in trials, thereby muddying the premise that the lay judge system truly represents the feelings of Japanese society as a whole. As the years went on, similar problems to trials in pre-war Japan began to rear themselves. Lay judges have continued to vote for stricter punishments, sentencing defendants to capital punishment, i.e. the death penalty, 20% more often than professional judges, according to Japanese lawyer and professor Muraoka Keiichi. Trials ran too long for citizens to endure, so trials were encouraged to wrap up quickly, leading to what some have considered hasty rulings that fail to properly account for all evidence and relevant circumstances. All in all, Japan's conviction rate has remained high, and the very concept of a jury is evidently met with either aggression from either end, or ambivalence from the majority of Japanese citizens. I've learned a lot about Japan's legal system and history over the course of making this video, and if you would like me to research and share even more, please do say so, but I think it's about time to finish my review of the funny red-vested lawyer game. Before I do, though, I'd like to theorize on why the jury system doesn't make a return in the mainline Ace Attorney games. As I've noted, Apollo Justice had the order to promote the lay judge system, and it did so rather shoddily in my opinion. Only one of the 4 cases mentions it, and it barely affected the case until the end. In a way, that's all but happened already. If you can guess which case I'm referring to, props to you. My guess is that the developers didn't want to shoehorn a jury into future games when the dynamic of the attorney, prosecutor, and judge had worked so well before, and higher-ups didn't want to continue endorsing a system that was quickly becoming controversial. I have heard that a jury of sorts is used and given much more involvement in the great Ace Attorney duology, but I have yet to play through any of that, so I'll hold my opinions. If you'd like to see that happen, you know what to do.